We are live.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. My name is Yara Leite, and I'm here to moderate Professor John Krige's talk, which is entitled Competition and Collaboration in Science Diplomacy.
We are live.
Okay, should I start again? Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all.
We have a little bit delay, Yara. If you are in the cell phone, you can go. Don't need to start again.
All right. So I see that people already followed what I said first. I was just saying good afternoon, good evening, or good morning for people who are in Brazil. I'm here to moderate. So Professor John Krige's talk, which is entitled Competition and Collaboration in Science Diplomacy. Professor Krige's talk is happening as part of the 10-year celebration of the grad program in international relations of the Federal University of Santa Catarina. I would like to thank our program's director, Professor Daniele Aires, for all the support in the organization of the events that have been part of that celebration, including this one. I would also like to thank Carolina Micheletti for helping us with the slides. Professor John Krige is a historian of science and technology and the Kranzberg Professor Emeritus at Georgia Tech's School of History and Sociology. He has a PhD in physical chemistry from the University of Pretoria and a PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Sussex. His research focuses on the interplay between science and technology and foreign policy. He led a team that wrote the history of the European space program, and after joining Georgia Tech in 2000, Professor John Krige started analyzing US-Europe relations during the Cold War. He also wrote a book on space collaboration involving NASA, which is the topic of his talk today. Among his most recent edited book, which I strongly recommend, is called How Knowledge Moves, Writing the Transnational History of Science and Technology. So John, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us today. A quick note to the participants. I want to please ask you to write your questions on YouTube chat, and I'll read them to John after his presentation. Don't forget to activate your YouTube notifications to our channel so you can keep following our 10-year celebration events. So thank you again. Thank you, John, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yara, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk this afternoon. I don't know how many people are actually attending it on YouTube because I can't see that, but welcome to you wherever you may be. And I just want to say, for those of you who are not native English speakers, if I speak too fast, please just make it clear to Yara and she will tell me to slow down. I have some slides that Carolina Micheletti will handle for me. And so we'll begin by just putting up my title slide and I'll get underway. Thank you, Carolina, that's perfect, thank you. It is widely recognized that the formal marriage between science and diplomacy was consecrated about 15 years ago by two prestigious Anglo-Saxon scientific organizations, Britain's Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Studies of science diplomacy, or SD, have flourished ever since, stimulated by a growing awareness of the importance of scientific understanding and international cooperation to tackle global issues like climate change and now, of course, COVID-19, the pandemic that is ravaging the world. This visibility and ebullient intellectual activity today should not blind us to the already existing and long-standing relationship between science and foreign policy in peacetime and its associated scholarship. Organized science and diplomacy have cohabited since the early Cold War, even before. Scientists and engineers have been crucial players in international affairs, most obviously in nuclear politics for over 70 years. international cooperation in space science and technology has, from the outset, been an affair of state. In other words, many scholars, including myself, have been researching and writing on science diplomacy without calling it that, well before it was elevated to a field of study in its own right. In this lecture, I want to draw on my past experience in the domain to make a few observations about the practice of science diplomacy that I hope will be useful to those of you now actively contributing to the field. Could you have the next slide, please? Science diplomacy, as has been defined by a leading scholar in the field, Pier Bruno Ruffini, who I hope is with us today, as a set of practices in which science and technology intersect with foreign affairs and international relations. That's taken from the paper that is, you can see there before you. Two factors facilitate this interaction. Firstly, scientific collaboration across borders is part and parcel of what it means to be a scientist. It is embodied in the norm of scientific internationalism, an ideology and a practice that promotes transnational cooperation between researchers who freely share new knowledge in the name of scientific progress. It is premised on universalism, on the idea that scientific consensus is possible, notwithstanding national and other ideological differences between people, because it is imposed by so-called objective facts about the world that everybody can agree on. In other words, governments don't have to coerce scientists to cooperate transnationally. Scientific internationalism is an already available value and practice that can be harnessed to foreign policy ends. The second key variable that facilitates this mobilization to international scientific collaboration is that governments themselves attach a significance to it. Military and economic strength and competitiveness are built on ceaseless innovation and the deployment of increasingly costly and complex knowledge systems. Through international collaboration, could I have the next slide, please? Through international collaboration, governments gain access to the global pool of knowledge in sectors of national interest to them, avoiding duplication and saving time and money. This question of avoiding duplication and saving time and money is a key driver of why governments are excited about and supportive of scientific internationalism. It is this convergence between the norm of scientific internationalism and governments' determination to participate actively in the global production and circulation of knowledge in some domains of science, innovation, and application that makes science diplomacy significant. It is extremely important to remember that transnational scientific collaboration is not always explicitly harnessed to foreign relations. Next slide, please. Indeed, as Lutz Leisdorf and Caroline Wagner have emphasized, a great deal of international organization collaboration in research is self-organized. In other words, it involves building networks in which, and I quote, the selection of a partner and the location of the research rely upon choices made by the researchers themselves on the basis of their scientific interests, rather than emerging through national institutional incentives or constraints. This vast domain of scientific collaboration is recognized by states and financially supported by a variety of national, regional, and international funding agencies. Self-organized scientific collaboration that is decoupled from the foreign policy agendas of governments is not, in my view, at least not for this talk, a candidate for science diplomacy. Science diplomacy gains traction when the intellectual interests of scientists and engineers overlap with the foreign policy interests and agendas of national governments and is entangled with them. The prestige of scientific associations that stimulated interest in science diplomacy and their successful advocacy for it has led to what Ruffini describes as a highly misleading, next slide please, practitioner-driven mainstream discourse of science diplomacy that ignores the role of national interests and of international competition in science diplomacy. Ruffini argues that this discourse was originally defined by academic researchers whose careers had evolved towards giving scientific advice to policymakers. They emphasized the importance of scientific cooperation between scientists in different nation states arguing that it would facilitate constructive constructive international solutions to global problems, reduce international tension, and improve understanding between peoples. This idealized view, inspired by the universalistic values of science, was later extended in the mainstream discourse to recognize, Ruffini says, the driving role of national interests and needs in science diplomacy. In Ruffini's view, even this concession to the national concerns that shape foreign relations does not go far enough, however. It underestimates the role of scientific and interstate competition and the asymmetric power relations that define the field in which science diplomacy is sometimes embedded. So conceptions of science diplomacy that are extended in this way, beyond the practitioner-driven original discourse, to embrace cooperation and competition in pursuit of national interests, are precisely those that have been present in much previously scholarly work on the intersection between science, technology, and foreign relations, including my own in these two books, for example. Could I have the next slide, please? In practice, science diplomacy brings together two cohorts of social actors, scientists and engineers on the one hand, and national governments representatives on the other, both of which strive to strike a balance between cooperation and competition in mobilizing knowledge as an instrument of foreign policy. Cooperation and competition, sharing and denying knowledge in pursuit of foreign policy goals, is at the heart of science diplomacy. The network of relationships implicated in the practice of science diplomacy is shaped by the kind of knowledge that is mobilized for foreign policy goals and by the variety of those goals in each national government. On the scientific side, the negotiations over the scope of scientific cooperation will obviously differ between, say, new research on high-yielding genetically modified seeds and on computer simulation of nuclear detonations, where the benefits of learning from other experts have to be balanced against the risks to economic competitiveness in the case of agriculture and national security in the case of the nuclear. For example, on the government side, different parts of the government will be engaged depending on which kind of scientific knowledge is involved. And different arms or agencies of the national bureaucratic state will also be engaged, often with conflicting priorities. It is easy to forget that in a democratic societies at least, the nation state is not a monolithic entity, but a polycentric amalgam of distinct bureaucratic units with their own missions and agendas. In the case of the United States, that I've studied extensively, any substantial program to harness science and technology to foreign policy will involve at least the State Department and the Department of Commerce, but it can also involve the Departments of Defense and the intelligence community, as well as a host of other agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. It simply depends on what kind of knowledge is at the core of the process of science diplomacy. The practice of science diplomacy, therefore, involves far more than an agreement on general principles at the diplomatic level. Harnessing science and technology to foreign policy involves fleshing out those principles through an ongoing process that engages multiple stakeholders in the scientific community and in different branches of the government that weigh the costs and benefits of international collaboration to the programs and research areas that they want to explore together. The next slide, please. International collaboration in space science as undertaken by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, is a nice example, almost an ideal type, that illustrates this aspect of my argument. NASA was established less than a year after the Sputnik satellites exposed the huge strides that the Soviet Union had taken in the development of rocket and missile capabilities, including, of course, satellite communications. The Space Act of 1958 that established NASA imposed two mission objectives on this body, on this administrative unit. Next slide, please. First, NASA was to undertake programs of international cooperation with other nations and groups of nations under the foreign policy guidance of the President. In other words, it was seen as an arm of American diplomacy in its very founding documents. And secondly, and this was actually the prime aim of NASA, its aim was to ensure the role of the United States as a leader in aeronautical space science and technology, and its application to peaceful uses. How was NASA to cooperate internationally while ensuring its leadership in science and technology? How do you square the circle between cooperation, which involves sharing, and leadership, which involves competing? The solution adopted by the first highly influential manager of the international program, a man called Arnold Frutkin, was that every collaborative venture was subject to two conditions. Could I have the next slide, please? Firstly, there was to be no exchange of funds between the collaborating partner. The United States would pay for their part of the program, and any partner, be it Europe, Brazil, India, Japan, would have to pay for their part of the program. And the second part was that there was to be clean interfaces between the technical contributions that each partner made to the joint program in space science. It was always about space science and technology. So that any foreign experiment had to have a clean interface with the American satellite that carried it into space. To secure American leadership in space science and technology, while collaborating with other countries, knowledge leakage across technical borders between personnel from different participating nations had to be reduced to the minimum. It's all about sharing and controlling the flow of knowledge. To share is to collaborate. The competition is the controlling side of the business. Western Europe was a preferred partner of NASA for the first 25 years of its existence, from 1958 to 1983. In that period, 33 out of 38 international cooperative programs were actually formed with Western Europe. 52 out of 73 PIs that flew experiments on NASA satellites were based in Western Europe. From Europe's point of view, this collaboration played a major role in kickstarting space science technology and industry on the old continent. But what about the United States? What was in it for NASA? John Logston, a leading analyst of US space policy, has summarized the benefits from America's point of view. They're summarized in Table 1. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a big table, and I want you to look at it quite carefully while I talk. And the first thing to notice, of course, is that there are three different kinds of benefits to NASA. These are benefits to NASA from collaborating with Europe over 25 years, as summarized in this paper. They're scientific and technical, they're political, and they're economic. So the first trivial point to make, right, is that there is a vast gulf between the original non-scientific arguments, the practitioner-driven version of why science diplomacy mattered, and the reasons that actually drove the state, in this case NASA, on behalf of the American government, to collaborate with other countries. In fact, the positive non-scientific externalities advanced early on in the mainstream discourse as characterized by Ruffini, namely that science diplomacy will improve trust and understanding between nations, reduce international tensions, and promote adherence to Miltonian norms in science and international bargaining, are nowhere to be seen in this table. They're little more than standard promotional rhetoric used by scientists engaged in political affairs and largely irrelevant to government decision makers. In fact, I interviewed Frutkin about these benefits, and I mentioned these ones that the practitioners of science diplomacy proposed, and he just laughed them out of court, saying that's what you talk about with your friends when you're having a barbecue in your garden. It's nothing to do about the reality of interstate relationships in science, what we now call science diplomacy, at least in this domain. The second clear point is that scientists and governments have very different, if overlapping, reasons for mobilizing science as a tool of diplomacy. Scientists are interested in advancing knowledge, building fruitful international networks, and of course, advancing their careers. Governments see the added value of access to the global pool of knowledge, but also have a range of national interests of reasons of state that motivate scientific diplomacy for them. These include obvious foreign policy agendas, like you can see down here in the political benefits, a positive image of the US, particularly vis-a-vis compared to in the third one there. So the openness of the United States compared to Soviet secrecy, and also, of course, economic benefits. And we must be careful about these economic benefits. It's not just simply a matter of saving money and improving balance of trade. It is also important that the legibility of scientific and technological, that you gain access and legibility to the scientific, technical, and industrial infrastructure of foreign partners when you collaborate internationally with them. And once you have a better understanding of what they can actually do, you can form new kinds of diplomatic and scientific relationships with them on the basis of what you've learned through the legibility granted by collaboration. Overall, as I stressed above, the rationale for government-sponsored and formally structured intercollaboration in science, as opposed to self-organized science, is multifactorial. It engages a variety of actors with very different, if overlapping, interests, and it aims to serve the scientific goals of the scientific community and the political, economic, and sometimes national security agendas of the administration. The third thing to note is how tightly linked collaboration is with competition. And here the benefits are incredible in the first part, scientific and technical benefits. In fact, cooperation in space science was explicitly intended to enhance US leadership, as you can see, by attracting foreign brain power to work along with the United States on challenging research questions, by shaping foreign programs to be compatible with American efforts, by limiting foreign funds for space activities that are competitive with our own, and opening doors for US science to participate in foreign programs. The asymmetry in resources between the US and Western Europe at the time ensured that US researchers were better positioned to take advantage of new and important scientific insights than their European scientists, partners, and rivals. As J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant scientific director of the Manhattan Project, pointed out to Congress soon after the end of the war, America has no monopoly on producing good ideas, but it is far better at turning them into practical devices and processes than anyone else. And that's behind these listed scientific and technical benefits here that NASA, or that Logsdon has summarized from his study of NASA in its dealings with Western Europe. I've stressed above that the kind of research that is practiced is a key variable for science diplomacy. Fundamental or basic research has always been a prime site for international scientific collaboration. Indeed, could I have the next slide, please? The distinction between basic or fundamental research and applied science, as blurred and ambiguous as it may be, was specifically invoked as a term of art by the United States Congress in the late 1950s to create a space in which knowledge could circulate freely across borders. The reason is obvious. The results of basic or fundamental science were published openly and were not yet of any immediate value to national economic or military strength. This dampened down national interests and facilitated international cooperation. It was one of the most important arguments in favor of CERN in the early 1950s. High-energy physics was so far removed from any economic or military objective that governments could pool their resources and make a major collective contribution to advancing human understanding about the mysteries of the atom without competing for access to the results of the experiments as such, because they had no particular economic or military interest in them. A sharp basic applied science distinction is implicit assumption underlying the mainstream practitioner discourse of science diplomacy as characterized by Ruffini. This discourse generalizes from a mode of scientific practice that is remote from application, and so from entanglements with national aspirations and international rivalry. Today, it is altogether unsustainable, as the distinction between fundamental and applied research is increasingly dissolved. As one think tank based at UC San Diego put it recently, and that's the quote that you can see underneath here, in the last paragraph, the translational speed in certain areas, such as life sciences, has accelerated, while in others, like artificial intelligence, the boundaries between basic science and applications are thin and porous. This porosity makes it meaningless to think of science diplomacy in terms of collaboration exclusively in basic science. Basic research, innovation, application, testing, and development often all merge seamlessly with one another. National rivalries unavoidably intertwined with international cooperation in many areas of science diplomacy because of this porosity between basic science, innovation, application, testing, development. Necessarily, in working on one, you're dragged into the other. And when that happens, national competition once again emerges because it has important military or commercial implications. As the boundary between fundamental research and practices that exploit knowledge for social purposes withers away, so the need for political and policy intervention in the name of national interest to protect national advantage becomes more urgent. The question is not any longer where does fundamental research end and applied research begin, because the boundary is totally unavailable. It's totally porous. The question is where to draw the line between knowledge that can be shared and knowledge that must be denied in the national interest. Could I have the next slide, please? Two factors come into play in the internal and international discussions and negotiations over where this line is drawn. The first concerns the knowledge itself. Is it ripe for exploitation for commercial or military purposes? The second concerns the extent to which your collaborating partner is able to actually reap those commercial or military benefits at your expense. Evidently, no government wants its researchers to share cutting-edge knowledge with a foreign power that can exploit it for commercial or military purposes to the disadvantage of the originating nation. Foreign policy arguments for collaborating in research with another country has to be balanced against national concerns to protect the competitive edge that one's country has in commercial or military domains. To illustrate this argument, I will take an example from my own work in the field of nuclear weapons policy with France and the United States. For 25 years after the end of World War II, successive American administrations were totally opposed to France developing an independent nuclear weapons program. Technology denial was used as a tool of foreign policy to curb and to redirect the French nuclear and missile ambitions in every possible way, as I've described in the volume I showed you earlier, Sharing Knowledge, Shaping Europe. This policy was radically revised by Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in the early 1970s. With West Germany opening out to the communist bloc through Ostpolitik, with US-Soviet détente gaining traction, and with President de Gaulle voted out of power, Nixon and Kissinger believed that the time had come to move beyond isolating France. Kissinger thus responded very positively to France's request for technological help with their missile and weapons programs. And he did so for unambiguous foreign policy reasons. Kissinger is quite clear about this. His aim, as he said, was to shape the basic orientation of French policy and to secure substantial French movement back into the integrated alliance structure under American leadership. An independent deterrent was not what he wanted. He wanted France to be part of the national global nuclear strategic posture led by the United States. What did the French scientists and engineers want from the United States? The Secretary of Defense, a man called Melvin Laird, explained that the French sought the benefit of American experience in solving some detailed, though apparently not catastrophic problems, to save them time and money involved in solving them on their own. The French did not want hardware. They wanted knowledge and information. They were particularly concerned about the reliability, quality control, and maintenance programs of several components in their weapons complex, particularly solid fuel propulsion, liquid nitrogen fuel tanks, gas bearings in gyroscopes, electrical connectors, and missile pyrotechnics, safety measures aboard some submarines. Now, the American authorities were willing to share their knowledge and experience in these domains so as to lock the French, I like this language, lock the French more closely into their global nuclear strategy, but only up to a point. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird came up with a specific policy to define where to draw the line at sensitive information that was not to be passed to the French. And he defined it like this in the next slide. Sensitive information is US information which, if released, could bring another party up to the US state of the art in areas where we believe we enjoy a technical advantage. Classic answer around how collaboration and competition function. And where such a technological advantage is a significant factor in our own weapons capability or posture. And then he added, of necessity, the delineation of such sensitive areas is a matter of considered technical judgment. Now, this is a really wonderful text, although it's very short, and I just want to make a few points about it. First, as I suggested, while the US is willing to collaborate in sharing knowledge with an ally for clear foreign policy reasons, that cooperation is limited by the competitive need to deny knowledge that can close the gap with those areas in which the US has a technological advantage. They don't want to lose that advantage. This does not apply to closing any and every technological gap. It only matters if the gap in question, quote, is a significant factor in our own weapons capability or posture. So he's very careful to define the scope in which the technology gap cannot be closed and the gap where it doesn't matter if it is closed. The logic echoes that of NASA. Scientific and technological collaboration for foreign policy ends must be framed by the need to maintain American scientific and technological leadership. The second key point is that this boundary line is not obvious. It is not some clear red line that cannot be crossed. It's not some checklist. Its definition, as Laird says, is a matter of considered technical judgment, implying that it will be negotiated on a case-by-case basis between the scientists and engineering communities themselves in America and in France. The implementation of science diplomacy, in other words, is a drawn-out process in which governments define general frameworks for cooperation, but in which scientists and engineers together work out for themselves the details of what knowledge will be shared and what will be denied. The third point I want to stress is that this is not only typical of a field like nuclear weapons, where obviously we would expect some constraints to be imposed on the circulation of knowledge. The core principles apply wherever collaboration moves beyond basic research as such and engages the production and circulation of new knowledge that has commercial and military applications. As I pointed out earlier, this situation prevails increasingly in the practice of SD today, and has led scholars like Ruffini to insist that national interests and competitive demands must be included in any analysis of science diplomacy. They converge in the concept of sensitive knowledge or information. For it is sensitive knowledge or knowledge that you define as sensitive to you in your negotiations, be you Brazil or the United States or Japan or Europe. It is sensitive knowledge that defines the boundary between what can be shared in a collaborative project and what must be denied, and that marks the point at which the receiver's capability to exploit what they learn risks reducing the competitive edge that the donor wants to maintain, even while collaborating. My final comment is a little bit a plug for my own field, my own work as an historian. It draws attention to the centrality of archival sources to historically grounded accounts of science diplomacy. Kissinger went to extreme measures to hide his cooperation with the French from Congress and the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, who should have been consulted over this change in policy, a very sharp change in policy after 25 years. But Kissinger was determined to respond to French requests for technical help and to reverse a long-standing policy of isolation going back to Eisenhower's days, policies that he knew would be vociferously opposed by some people in the administration. We only have this detailed insight into Kissinger's famous backdoor diplomacy thanks to the release of a special collection of superb documents by the National Security Archive about 5 years ago. And this provides you with a springboard for a few concluding methodological observations. To begin with, I want to stress that the ideological grip of scientific internationalism can have two unfortunate effects, especially if we use internationalism to explain why knowledge moves transnationally, and why scientists collaborate and why governments collaborate with each other in SD. Could I have the next slide, please? Something's gone wrong here. Oh, yes. Sorry, that's what I should have done before. Could I have the next slide, please? So these are the risks. Firstly, if you take scientific internationalism as an explanation, you avoid asking the crucial question of what sensitive knowledge is not shared in a collaborative effort, because you simply take it for granted that scientists will want to collaborate with each other anyway, because they're driven by the force and pressure and norm of scientific internationalism. And secondly, of course, if you assume that this collaboration is automatic between scientists, you reduce the role of the state in the process of science diplomacy to a mere facilitator or catalyst for science diplomacy. The next slide, please. Both of these oversimplifications trivialize the complexity of science diplomacy and are difficult to overcome. Scientists are often reluctant or not allowed to discuss sensitive knowledge that is walled off for international collaboration, for the obvious reason that it is sensitive and therefore not something that is relevant to their commercial competitive position or military position, and therefore they're not going to talk about it. Similarly, internal disputes between different arms of the government over the wisdom of mobilizing critical knowledge that may have commercial or military uses are also extremely difficult to access. So in fact, understanding how science diplomacy works when you study case studies is extremely difficult if you simply speak to scientists themselves and you speak to governments themselves, because both parties have a vested interest in concealing the knowledge that they are not sharing, the knowledge that they're denying. And this emphasis I want to stress again and again on knowledge denial is part and parcel of the very widespread international competition that is also part and parcel of international affairs when science and diplomacy are tools of foreign policy. The last little point to make is that historians, and that's my very last slide, and that's just to plug my last slide, please. Oops. As historians, we have the advantage of being able to use official documents to study many of the complex negotiations, the intersection between science, technology, and foreign policy. We are able to see the disputes and disagreements that necessarily accompany the transnational circulation of knowledge between nation states in a competitive world order, and that are deliberately rendered invisible by science and state alike. I hope that my talk today has persuaded you, and those of you who study science diplomacy, that history can serve as an invaluable resource, if only by raising important questions that otherwise you may not see. Thank you, and that's my last slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was an amazing talk. Let me just see if I can get my video back here. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll just do some comments, a couple of comments and questions, and while we wait for people on YouTube to post their questions as well. Professor John, I found it very interesting that this distinction between fundamental and applied research and only stimulating collaboration in fundamental research did not hinder collaboration to identify knowledge that could go back to the United States in an applied form, right? I mean, there was this distinction. We will not, the US will not stimulate a collaboration in applied research, but that did not mean that American scientists would not bring knowledge back home to applied purposes.
Right.
Very interesting.
At that time, America's power and capacity to exploit scientific knowledge was so immense, and still is so immense, that they always believed that compared to other nations, they had what they used to call in some ways the Yankee approach, the Yankee practical approach to think about what can we do with this to improve the world, right? Or to improve our military strength or to improve our competitive strength. And that for them was an almost instinctive reaction. And they had the resources to do it and the industrial capacity to do it. It's exactly the argument with China today, right? That China is interested in IP because China can exploit it so more rapidly and so more efficiently at the moment with the huge resources that it has than can other partners, including even the United States. And that's the real source of the debate with China. So if you have an American scientist sharing, shall we say, basic research on electric batteries, like Charles Lieber, the famous man from Harvard, who's now in great difficulty, sure, he has a lab for developing electric batteries in Wuhan, and he has one in Harvard, but venture capitalists in China, that Americans fear, will jump on any kind of result which looks remotely promising in fundamental research and turn it rapidly into an improved electric battery, which will soon outcompete anything that the United States will do because they're much more slow in developing electric batteries, for example, a very important part of new markets. So yes, the United States has this conviction, and it was certainly the world leader, certainly ahead of Western Europe, way through the Cold War and beyond. Now China proves how important this is too, and that's one of the great fears that the US has of China, that it will turn basic fundamentals knowledge with any kind of promise, not all of it, but with promise, very rapidly into a competitive advantage.
Hey, thank you very much. Julia Mascarello, which is our PhD candidate, has a question. Well, she has a comment here. She says, thanks for the lecture, Professor Krige. I'm a huge fan of your work. And she asks if you think that the benefits of collaboration among northern countries are the same when northern countries cooperate with southern ones. So she's asking if there is a difference between the amount of benefits when we have a north collaboration or a north-south one, and which interests are involved in that case.
Well, Ruffini has stressed the importance of cooperation and competition in asymmetrical conditions. And it is regrettably true that North-South collaboration can lead to huge advantages for the North, often at the expense of countries in the South. I mean, simply for the reasons that putting China now on the side of the North, obviously, because generally we didn't used to do that, putting China on the side of the North. So technically advanced, well-endowed, financially and industrially countries have a huge advantage in this because they can react so much more rapidly. And the pool of brain power that they have access to is so large. And of course, as you see, I mean, in the case of NASA, which is still very pertinent, you attract smart people to work on questions that interest the United States. And they're already, in that case, for example, they're already positioning themselves to take advantage of this kind of thing. And so what people do obviously is work out where the best people in any country are working in this field. And obviously they're happy to collaborate with them, and they're happy for their governments to do so as well, because especially if they think they can gain an economic or military advantage from it. As I say, these boundaries between a basic and applied are more and more porous. And so it's much more difficult to say, well, all we're doing is sharing basic research. So yes, I'm afraid I think it is far more disadvantageous for the southern countries to collaborate with northern countries, unless they do so in very specific domains where they know what they want and they're prepared rapidly to benefit from the knowledge that they gain. That's very important. And of course, also make sure that there's no brain drain from the south to the north. I mean, the United States currently has a deliberate policy of China's policy, first of all, in the 1,000 Talents program, is to reverse the brain drain of Chinese talent to the United States. It's the first time the United States has faced such a situation itself. It's a situation that every European country and also countries like Brazil face, that your brightest and your best people are attracted away as soon as they know what you can do, attracted away to strengthen the research ecosystem of the more powerful partner. So that's something, as long as one is careful to try to avoid that happening, I think the South can obviously gain a lot from collaborating with the best in the world, obviously. But it's one that has to be done carefully targeted with a full understanding of what the risks are and a full attempt to reap the benefits quickly as soon as one can.
Thank you again, Professor. We have more comments here, people thanking for your talk. Ian Ribeiro, Vitória Luisa Ramos, they are all thanking for the opportunity to hear you. And well, since Julia mentioned, and you mentioned this North-South relationship, do you think that in these cases, maybe the strongest country can share sensitive knowledge for economic purposes or security ones, if the strongest country already knows that the developing one won't be able to absorb that knowledge? I mean, they can share, but because they know partner countries won't be able to learn from it, you know, and to which extent this can be a very potent source of soft power, right?
That's an interesting, yeah. You probably know more about that than I do.
No, just to give you an example, I mean, we have a history of space collaboration with China, for instance, Brazil, right?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of knowledge has been shared and not much has been absorbed, you know. Well, that I cannot conclude from that the Chinese government already knew that it would share that knowledge, knowing that Brazil would not have an absorptive capacity, right? But this is something we wonder, to which extent a sensitive knowledge can be shared in a context where the strongest part already knows it won't be absorbed, or to which extent a technology can be shared when it already knows that it is ineffective. I mean, look at everything that the US did to stop Germany from doing nuclear collaboration with Brazil during the Cold War. They acted, I mean, this is very interesting in your work as well. It's not only about the bilateral relationship, right? US and the partner. It is also the mobilization to hinder other countries that have some kind of knowledge to share them with other countries, right? There is a whole network of relations that are worked on that. And I remember that the US really did many things for many years to hinder Germany from doing nuclear collaboration with Brazil. And when finally it happened, Germany transferred technology to us that it was not effective. So to which extent the American government already knew that technology was ineffective, and simply allowed it to happen, you know. Can we hear from you on that a little bit?
Yeah, if you're talking about the United States, of course, it's different to other countries, I think, probably. First of all, it thinks globally and has a global agenda, right? And in the field of nuclear and nuclear technology, the case of France is the same as the case of Germany. They were really afraid of other countries having independent nuclear deterrence. So that everything had to be done to stop Germany getting a nuclear weapon and to stop France getting a nuclear weapon. And of course, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. The United States felt that was something it had a global mission to do, is to stop the proliferation of nuclear technology. So nuclear technology is a little bit sui generis. But but of course, we have exactly the same situation with Huawei at the moment, right? Where the United States decided that Huawei was a security threat to the United States government, and it has done all that it can to stop other countries collaborating with Huawei. For example, France collaborates extensively with Huawei just down the street from where I live, there's a huge new laboratory with brilliant French mathematicians and applied physicists working along with engineers from Huawei. The United States does not like this, and it can go to the measure of imposing sanctions. So it has this great extraterritorial reach. It does, in fact, stop other countries doing things it doesn't like with certain partners that it doesn't want to see grow in strength and power. And Huawei is the classic example. As the nuclear was the case in the Cold War, and it stopped, as I say, Germany dealing with Brazilian nuclear matters. It tried always that kind of thing. I mean, France was the one that tended to go behind America's back and help India. Then India still went back to work with America afterwards. So so of course you can always, if that happens to you, you can find another partner instead of that America cannot have so much influence over. If you want to continue working with, say, Huawei, then America can punish you heavily for that. But if you want other similar kinds of technology, you can find other partners who can be useful to you. But so, yes, I do think that the United States has a global mission and ambition to control the distribution and the circulation of certain kinds of sensitive technologies. And certainly it stops its allies doing that especially with China today, if it sees it as against its interest. It doesn't want to see a strong Huawei. And it's going to, anyone who tries to help build a strong Huawei will be told that the United States does not like that happening. Do they do it as an instrument simply? Do they just share strong, valuable knowledge as an instrument of soft power? Well, it would backfire, wouldn't it? If you realize that they were just giving you useless information, the whole idea of it being soft power would backfire, because you'd say they're treating us like idiots. We know this is just second-rate technology. So they might do it, but they make a serious mistake with any mature country like your own, who would say, well, look, I mean, you're just giving us rubbish. Don't pretend that this is valuable. So I think probably that's unlikely. I mean, I think in that case, you have to ask specifically why they're doing it. And what do they specifically want from us? I mean, what specific interests do they have in Brazil? It is, as I've stressed again and again, always part of a broader agenda. There are multiple stakeholders in government that are involved in this process, not just the scientific agencies, for example. And there might be other interests involved that you're not aware of, who say, well, look, okay, we're giving away some quite sensitive and important knowledge for us, and there is a risk, but the risk is worth taking because of these benefits. And those have to be, in this case, where they are, they're giving you something really valuable to them. You need to ask very precisely what are the benefits, and do quite a lot of digging in unusual places to try to see why they're doing that in your case, and not in your case in particular.
Thanks again, Professor. Julia has a second question. She says that she doesn't know if it is very clear to her when you talked about self-organized collaboration versus science diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
So in your opinion, we can find national interest even in collaboration among scientists?
Well, self-organization specifically is defined by Leitsdorf and Wagner and Caroline Wagner in a very specific way, right? In which she says, and I should just get the definition again, excuse me, my papers have fallen on the ground, but it's something about that they collaborate with people whom they choose, irrespective of national incentives or national arrangements, irrespective of what their government might be arranging or what their government's particularly interested in. It's just two scientists getting together saying, hey, you do really interesting work in the field of electric batteries. I'd like to work with you to see what we can do together. And that then results in open publication in the literature. And a huge amount of science is just like that. Somebody goes to a paper at a conference, hears that there's a really smart guy in Wuhan who's doing work in his or her field, and then goes and speaks to them afterwards and said, look, why don't we collaborate together on this project that I'm interested in, without ever considering whether the governments are involved or not. That's not formally a part of the process of science government, because the government is not explicitly a negotiating partner in the process. is it still science? Well, I explicitly excluded that, because for me, if we're talking about science diplomacy, when the word diplomacy is in the picture, the state is an actor. We can't call it diplomacy otherwise. I mean, that's the way I want to define it. Otherwise, it just becomes totally, the whole thing becomes too diffuse, and science diplomacy doesn't pick out any particular kind of scientific collaboration, namely one that is in the framework of intergovernmental negotiations and discussions. So I think you just evacuate the concept of any meaning if you allow for self-organization, as defined by Leitzdorf and Wagner, into the realm of science diplomacy. You evacuate it of meaning. It doesn't mean to say it's not of important national interest. And of course, it can be the step towards governments becoming more involved, but it's not, in my view, science diplomacy, or not usefully thought of as science diplomacy. I don't know if that satisfies Julia. Is she satisfied with that?
Well, I think we can just discuss this a little bit more. It's very clarifying. But the state, John, can act in many ways when it's acting towards scientific collaboration. Wagner's work says, her thesis, her argument is that after the Cold War, scientific collaboration started happening more and more, and that the states are not intervening in that. That is happening spontaneously for reasons that are endogenous to science. That's her argument. And she shows, for instance, that except in big science projects where there is finance coming from the state, her argument is that most and the vast majority of scientific collaboration does not happen being financed by the states. So therefore, she concludes that this is a spontaneous agenda. So what I want to ask you two questions about that. Is financing the only means the states have to intervene, to be part? What instruments, what range of instruments besides financing do states have to support or hinder scientific collaboration? And my second question is, in political science, we take very seriously when states decide not to act, because they can decide to act to hinder or to stimulate scientific collaboration, or the state can decide not to act. So my question is, how do we know if there is a state supervision when the state is simply allowing laissez-faire to work? This is, I think, maybe in these situations, we could still talk about science diplomacy. And it's very different when the state doesn't even know it's happening. When the state doesn't even know it's happening, it's not, it doesn't have mechanisms to know whether its scientists are collaborating or not. Of course, this is not science diplomacy because they don't even know it's happening. But I'm asking you if there is a third option, not only supporting or hindering, but a third option, meaning just letting laissez-faire to work and people would collaborate freely, but the state still knows it's happening. What do you think? I'm not sure if I'm clear. So it's two questions. What are the means, the instruments the states have to supervise these relations besides financing directly? And the second one, is there a third option for states to be supervising besides supporting or hindering and allowing laissez-faire to work?
Well, the state is a very amorphous concept. So if you talk about the scientific agencies of the state, like NASA, for example, or the Atomic Energy the Atomic Energy Authority, right? Or the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, NASA didn't finance anything, as I pointed out, right? They made a proposal saying, we have a technology, and if you'd like to work with us on that technology, using our technology, we have the rockets, we have the satellites, we have the resort, we have the industry. You can put experiments on our satellites. You pay for your experiment, we pay for our side, and there's no exchange of funds, and there's no and there's clean interfaces, and we work together on a project. For example, some of the NASA projects with Europe involved using 2 satellites because they needed 2 satellites at specific positions in space. You put up your satellite, you put up our satellite, and we exchange data between us. So the state will sign an agreement, an interstate agreement, because they've got to guarantee the funding for the European satellite from somebody, somewhere. So in necessary, I mean, it's not as though they offer money here, but the governments negotiate an agreement in which each party agrees to pay for their part. Otherwise, it's ridiculous that NASA starts its part and the Europeans never get, and the Europeans don't start at all. So there are ways in which you can offer to help together, work together by making your technology available in this case, and no money passes, right? And that's one way in which it's not just a matter of funding. I think you're absolutely right, and Wagner is right. I mean, you can call it post-Cold War. I'll call it the globalization of the knowledge economy, I prefer to call it that. Yes, of course, there's a huge amount of international collaboration, which just goes on, so to speak, spontaneously between people, because they have a shared interest in solving a particular kind of problem. And the states are willing to finance that, or the universities finance that, or their grant finances that. If you get a grant from the National Institutes of Health, you include travel money to go to a conference in China where you share your information with Chinese people. In a sense, they're financing it, but they don't monitor it. They don't have a vested particular interest in it. There's no great decision-making process around it. Surely they've understood that the best way to promote science in their own countries is to let their scientists do what they really like, right? And then, of course, come up with formalized arrangements when there are opportunities for it, right? So, and of course, industry, Huawei does that as well on behalf of the Chinese government. And you can just funding study abroad is another way of doing it, okay? That's what the 1,000 Talents program does with China. So money comes in somewhere, but in very indirect ways sometimes. So it's not just a question of, so I want to stress that, I think. But I must, again, think that this vast process of international collaboration, I mean, I think there's something like, the number of papers that are published every year is astronomical, and they're jointly authored. I think 270,000 papers are co-authored between American and Chinese authors in 2020 or 2018. 270,000 between America, one author in America, one author in China. That's a vast output of work, which of course the state is nowhere in that. Now it is. It's becoming more and more concerned about this work and what's going on in it. But the vast amount of work is not something that can fall under the rubric of science diplomacy, in my view. It's just science. It falls under the rubric of scientific internationalism. The big risk is to see the scientific internationalism as the driver of everything, because it isn't. And if you think it, you actually don't ask, well, wait a minute. And is knowledge also being denied in these international collaborations? And actually, it would be a good research project, even on self-organized research, to speak to to partners and say, by the way, I mean, are you really freely sharing all the knowledge that you discovered together? Or are you being very careful to hold back some, either because you're just competing as scientists do for credit and approval? Merton mentioned all of that, right? This competitive side is intrinsic to science too, for being the first to get the publications out and so forth. Or are you also shielding work because it might be of commercial or military interest? And they don't want to talk about it. I mean, and most people don't even ask the question. And I think that we would really only know how freely this process is happening if we ask those questions more systematically. People might be protecting state interests and national interests without even formally being arms of their government. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks again, John. Well, I remembered about that Mario Daniel's chapter on visa controls as well. Can you just speak briefly about it, how visa controls are an instrument for the states to act as well?
Well, certainly, if the main purpose is to control how knowledge moves around the world and to limit that kind of exchange, one way of limiting it is by not having knowledgeable people come into your country and absorb knowledge from you. And in our big book with Mario, there's a whole section that I wrote about science, Soviet scientists coming to visit the United States in the 1980s, going to MIT and asking to see this lab, and this lab, and the State Department saying they can't come, they can't go to that lab, they can't go to that lab. And of course, also not giving them a visa to come to the country, to deny them access to knowledge in the United States. So one way to control this new movement of knowledge is also to control the movement of people who have the knowledge. And the way the state can do that is through visas. And by the way, again, with China, there's a huge new control over Chinese students coming to the United States, you know. And even certain kinds of fields that they might want to study in, they will not get a study visa for more than 1 year in certain key fields, instead of for graduate studies. Whereas normally they would get it for 3 or 5 years. Now the State Department will only give them a visa for 1 year in certain key areas like advanced manufacturing, aeronautics, and one other field. So you can control access of people to knowledge in your country by denying them a visa or by putting very tight visa restrictions around the kind of subjects they can study. And that's also what this whole idea. Visas is another instrument of controlling and denying access to knowledge that you think is sensitive and you don't want your competitors to get.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for bringing these cases on US China collaboration and non-collaboration. As I told you, this is among the biggest interests in our community at this point. Yeah. So I have another question here of Renan Parolin, who is also a member of our research group on international relations and science and technology. He asks if you have any consideration about Chinese technological competition, considering its science diplomacy on the One Belt, One Road initiative, and if it is any similar to US or the European Union.
I really can't answer that question, I'm afraid. I mean, that's such a vast, for me at the moment, that's an infrastructure initiative of gaining access to markets. That's the way it's always presented here, right? It's a short circuit to the European market, a short point of access to the European market. Of course, they also try to, as part of that process, open a whole new university in Hungary, as you know. That has been stopped inside Hungary. The European Union was not keen about it. America was not keen about it at all. And I think that process has been stopped. But at this moment, as I see Belt and Road, it's an infrastructure project. So it's a general attempt by China to extend trade routes, which is why, of course, they use it, Belt and Road, anyway, into various parts of the globe. I see no obvious link with science diplomacy at this moment, I'm afraid.
Okay, Professor Krige. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any other questions. We have some comments here. Julia made some comments on how developed countries impose some agendas. Well, her research, actually, it's on Brazil, Germany bioeconomy research. She actually shows that it's not an imposition, a direct imposition, but how the capacity of the Germans to know which kind of knowledge in bioeconomy is produced all over the world. And they already know that. And when they propose a collaboration with Brazil, they already know exactly what they want from Brazil. So her argument is that the source of asymmetry is not on the hard power itself, you know, but how on domestic sources, the fact that Germany has plans on bioeconomy and detailed plans on what they want from each part of the world. And when they come and knock on Brazil's door, and Brazil accepts proposals, but Brazil is not as acquainted as Germany with this global agenda on bioeconomy, and it's not like an active negotiator in the sense of, oh, which partner country do we want? Let's go and knock on their door. It's just we react, you know.
Right. Well, I see the point. In fact, I made the point indirectly, not as clearly as you've just made it, when I was speaking about economic benefits from my table of NASA. And I pointed out that it's not just about, if you collaborate with somebody, you lower the cost of your collaboration and you learn about new markets. I said you have a greater legibility and accessibility to the way, through collaborating, you learn a lot more about the inner dynamics of what another country is and does. And of course, that you can position yourself better for another round of dealings the next time, because you gain this knowledge that the Germans have in this field. And it's an incredible resource because, as you say, Brazil hasn't got the time or perhaps the energy or perhaps the will to spend so much effort on figuring out this particular field and where the action is. Germany's made an investment in that, has invested a lot of money in analyzing the global distribution of labor in this field, and now will selectively target bits and pieces of that global system to benefit and strengthen its own system, while at the same time, of course, helping you. But they'll be very careful about what they tell you, which they'll not tell some other. And then what they will share and what they deny with each partner will be very different, so they can optimize their benefits out of the process. That's clear. And so the only way to counter that is to do the same.
That's the dilemma, right?
Exactly. If you don't have infinite resources, it's very hard.
Yes. And if you have, you probably act the same way, right?
Yes, right.
Okay, Professor. It was great to have you here. Thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts, for your ideas, and for your availability to share your ideas with us. This was a precious moment to our community, and we'll send you the link for for your talk in case you want to share with other people as well. It will be there on YouTube.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Yara, and it's a pleasure, and I hope people enjoyed it. How many people are on the YouTube link? Do you know?
Well, we got to 20 people, not much, John. We actually have, yeah, but mainly our community. Well, at least the people that are expressing themselves on chat, I can actually see who they are, besides the one that talked on the chat. But well, anyway,
I'm glad your community benefited from it. That's the most important group of people for me. Thank you.
Yes, and well, as the link will be on YouTube, people usually prefer to just watch it whenever they can. So it will be there. And we'll keep commenting. And thank you very much again. And good afternoon, good evening there, right? It's
thank you. And good afternoon to you in Brazil.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.